Hello, everyone, and welcome to Evenings with an Author at the American Library in Paris. My name is Emily Biggs, and I'm the Programs Manager here at the library. Tonight, I'm so delighted to be welcoming two experts in lunar science, Ryan Zeigler and Christine Shupla, as we discuss developments in space research. This is a bit of a different theme from the usual Evenings with an Author. These are not two authors that I'm joined by tonight, but these are two brilliant researchers in their fields, and they have a lot to teach us about why scientific literacy matters, what the new developments in space research are, and why we should care. So I'm very excited to dive in. Before we get started, just a couple of notes. If this is your first time, after about 45 minutes of our discussion, I will open this up to questions first from our in-person audience, and if we have time, our Zoom audience as well, who's inside that camera right there. Hello, Zoom audience. Thank you for joining us on this strangely cold, late April night. And that's that. So on to our brilliant speakers tonight. First we have Christine Shupla, who manages the Lunar Planetary Institute Science Engagement staff with 16 years of experience in NASA's planetary science education community and 15 years of experience in informal science education. She also leads the Lunar Planetary Institute's scientist engagement efforts, providing professional development and resources to assist planetary scientists in their efforts to share their science with public audiences. Christine, thank you for joining us tonight. Sitting next to Christine is Mr. Ryan Zeigler, who is NASA's Lunar Sample Curator in the Astromaterials Acquisition and Curation Office of the Astromaterials Research and Exploration Science Division, which is one of the coolest sentences I have had the joy of saying out loud in my time in this role. The principal focus of Ryan's research is using geochemistry to better understand how the moon formed, how it differentiated, and how impacts have subsequently altered its surface. And tonight's event was generously organized in partnership with the Ephémérides organization, which promotes space research and space education in France as well. So thank you so much to this organization for their help in bringing these two speakers into the reading room tonight. Can we have a round of applause? Please. So, the moon is 4.5 billion years old, and that's too many years for us to go into in depth. So I thought we could start with a bit more modern history. And before we dive into current developments in lunar research, I want to talk about the sort of one period in lunar science that sort of immediately comes to everyone's heads, which is the Apollo missions. If you could tell briefly, for those who might be a bit rusty with their moon knowledge, what these missions achieved, what they allowed us to learn about the moon, and why they stopped.
Why they stopped. Okay, yeah, that's not a setup. All right. So, from 1969 to 1972, there were 6 Apollo missions that went to the moon, that landed on the surface of the moon. So 12 people walked on the moon, and they collected 382 kilograms of rocks and soil from those locations. And so since then, it's been almost 55 years now. Scientists are still studying the samples, and we've used those samples to understand how the moon formed and how the early Earth changed and has evolved in time. We've also used the moon rocks to study basically every other planet in our solar system as well. And so what we brought back on Apollo has informed us not just of the moon, but really of the entire solar system and even beyond our solar system.
And how does that work on a more technological level, using these rocks to study other planets as well?
So it depends on the question you're asking, but because we've been to the surface and we know where the samples were collected, you can use what you can tell from orbit using spacecraft and then compare those to the samples themselves. And so the easiest thing to probably understand for an enthusiastic but not professional scientist is crater counting. So if we look at the surface of other planets like Venus or Mars, they've estimated the absolute age. So you've said 4.5 billion years. So they might talk about a part of Mars that's 2 billion years old. And where that 2 billion years comes from is by using the surfaces of cratered surfaces on the moon. So you pick up a rock from there, that surface is 3 billion years old, you count how many craters there are, and you get a rough craters per billion years rate, and it's way more complicated than that, but that's the general gist. And so you can use that as just one example of how you're taking what you know from the moon and extending it to basically all the other planets.
And I'd like to add two things to that. So many people are familiar with this idea of carbon dating. Well, scientists like Ryan and others can do something similar, but not with carbon, with elements that will go back much, much farther, much greater ages to date some of these moon rocks, or parts of the moon rocks, because different parts might be different dates, and use that to tell how old certain things are, and then how many craters are there, and then compare that. So it's you learn this, after you learn A, then you can learn B. After you learn B, you can learn C. It's a stepping procedure. And then the other piece that I wanted to add is that not only are we learning more about the solar system, we're learning more about our own planet and how Earth formed and changed over time as well because of our studies of the moon.
In what ways are we learning that?
So it's very difficult to tell how old things on the Earth are because so much of the Earth is constantly changing. We have plate tectonics, we have oceans, we have erosion. It is very hard to find a very old rock on the Earth. They tend to get demolished and subducted and melted and things happen to them. So a lot about what we know about the age of the Earth and the age of the solar system comes from rocks like the moon rocks, as well as meteorites from space, for instance. And one of the things that many scientists would love to do is go to the moon and find a rock on the moon that was ejected from the early Earth. Wouldn't it be amazing to go and pick up a rock that was actually from the Earth, from back when the Earth was first forming? Oh, that would be amazing. It would be like finding a treasure, right? You know, like treasure hunting in your attic, like that.
Well, it sounds like someone should go back to the moon then.
Good thing we planned for that.
Let's talk about it. First, actually, you didn't answer the second half of my question, and I will push you on that because I think it's compelling. What happened to Apollo? We were discovering how old the Earth is. Where did that go?
Apollo wasn't a scientific program. Apollo was a political program. Apollo was about beating the Soviet Union to the moon, and we did that. And so we managed to get 6 missions to the surface out of it, which is a lot. I mean, they had planned for Apollos 18, 19, and 20, and they decided to spend the money on something else. And so I don't know exactly where the money went, but that's why we have the Saturn V rockets in various museums around the country now, because it was a very expensive program. Back then, NASA was about 4.5% of the federal budget. I think now it's somewhere like 0.4% of the federal budget. So, they were getting 9 or 10 times more funding than they are now. Yeah.
And so in the interval between the end of this sort of geopolitical frenzy for getting to the moon, for getting into space, and where we find ourselves now as we're preparing to return to the moon, what developments in lunar science and space technology took place that are significant that we should know about?
I mean, NASA kept, it wasn't like NASA didn't do anything. They just, they switched to shuttle, and then they switched to space station. And so now we're switching back to the moon. In the meantime, it's not like what has happened most since Apollo that has taught us about the moon are orbital missions, because those cost a lot less money. It costs a lot less to put a satellite in orbit around the moon than it does to put people on the surface. And because we were in a race in the 60s, we didn't do the exploration of the moon in the normal way. Normally, you would map the entire surface, figure out exactly where you want to land, and then land there. Well, we didn't have time for that. So we picked 6 good spots, and they landed there. And then later, we mapped the entire surface, and now we can see, so since the Apollo era, we've had the Clementine mission in the 90s, and then Lunar Prospector, and then now we've got the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. Other countries have sent orbital missions, and so we know so much more about the whole surface of the moon from orbit. But that only tells you a certain percentage of what you need to know. And so now we're at the point where it's time to go get some more rocks to use to better interpret that orbital data.
And we also have new motives now. We're thinking not just of going to the moon to study it briefly, but going there and potentially setting up a launching base to go on to Mars. Because the moon has less gravity, it's much easier to send a rocket into space to Mars from the moon than it is from the Earth. So the idea would be if we can set up a mechanism for building rockets, and if we have the materials that we would need to launch them there, then that would be expeditious. That would be a good thing. And we have found that at the moon's north and south poles, there are these craters, deep craters, where the sun never shines. It's always dark. And those areas, we have lots of evidence now, have a certain amount of frozen water. Water can be broken down into the constituents, the components that you need for rocket fuel. So there's a lot more that we know about the moon now, and more ideas that people have been thinking about for a while, about the ways that we could go to the moon, learn more about our Earth and our solar system, and also work with the moon long term for future space exploration.
And it was the orbital missions that revealed to us that there were these possible water sources.
Yeah, I mean, there were some ground-based radar that could see them too from Arecibo, especially, but no, it was mostly the orbital missions. And until very recently, they had never actually seen water. They just saw hydrogen, which the most common form of hydrogen is usually tied up in water. And so there's still so much we don't know about the water or really the volatiles that are at the South Pole. I mean, there's certainly ice there because the LCROSS mission crashed into one of these permanently shadowed regions. And
Intentionally.
Intentionally, yes. NASA likes to crash things on purpose. And
why? Could we just pause and explain why we're intentionally crashing into things?
Because it was the easiest way to see if there was water there. So they had a mission and called Laddie. That's a different mission. But part of it was to spike a heavy part of the spacecraft into a permanently shadowed crater, and they pointed every telescope on Earth at it, and they could see the vapor plume that came off from it, and then you could measure different compounds in the vapor plume, including water and methane and ammonia, and there's a bunch of different compounds. So the one really solid data point we have for how much and what is there comes from one of the KBS craters from the LCROSS impact. And so that was a really sort of cheap but effective way to get an answer.
Think of dropping a minibus into a big frozen area and seeing what comes out.
It's an effective analogy, and I can see your training in science education. Let's talk about Artemis. What is this mission? What is going to be achieved?
I mean, so Artemis is NASA learning to send people into deep space again. Relearning, I guess, is a better way to put it. So, Christine already said, ultimately NASA's goal is to go on to Mars, and the name of the program is the Moon to Mars program. But it's a 20-month or more round trip to Mars, and so before you try to do that, you got to figure out how to do all of the different parts that are going to be required for that. And the best place to do that is with the moon. And so the Artemis mission is to figure out, to relearn how to land people on the moon and get them back off. And so, I mean, they had Artemis 1, which was uncrewed, and now we've got Artemis 2, which is coming, and that's on the books and has an announced crew. And then Artemis 3 is the scheduled landing on the moon. And so it's about getting people back. So it's not just a science mission either. This is a technology mission. This is a, learning to move beyond Earth's orbit.
And building the technology and the infrastructure for this as well. One of the ideas is a gateway is having something that orbits the moon so that instead of just shooting people from the Earth directly to the moon over and over and over again, you could have a station, a way station, a bus stop on the way, a place to unload your luggage and restock and anyway.
Sort of on the way.
On the way-ish, yeah. This has been described as one of the most complex undertakings of engineering and human ingenuity in the history of deep space exploration to date. Can you walk us through the various complexities that are at stake here? In very simple terms, keeping in mind that we're a bunch of bookworms and many of us, including me, may have degrees in the humanities.
Well, you also have to understand I'm a geologist, not a rocket scientist. So, I worry about the rocks they're going to bring back. There's an Artemis curator or curation lead who she is, much more versed in this. So, it's a lot of different technologies that have to work in order for this to happen. So you have to have a heavy lift launch vehicle. During Apollo, we had the Saturn V. Now we have the SLS, the Space Launch System, SLS. And so a big rocket's a technologically challenging thing to do, and that Artemis 1, it worked, and that's great. You've got to have a way to get them to the moon and back, and you've got to have the vehicle. You've got to have a way to land on the moon and get back off, and that's where the NASA has contracts with 2 different companies to design a lander to get it down. You have to have communications on the surface. You have to, there's just things, what do you call it, life support systems to get you there and back. So all of these different things. I mean, I know more about Apollo, so it's easier for me to talk about that. But it was something like 400,000 people worked on the Apollo program. It was dozens of countries, companies all over the country building all the different components. And this has got to be something on a similar par because, while I don't know the exact numbers for Artemis, it's more complicated now than it was then because we're trying to do more. We're sending 4 people, not 2 people, or not 3 people, and it's a bigger spacecraft and a bigger everything. And so, yeah, it's just a lot of different technologies.
And they're not just talking, so Apollo was about camping on the moon. Here we're talking about building a village on the moon. So you need different parts. You need to set up things. You need to set up the technology. And we're talking about a part of the moon that has a lot of benefits and a lot of challenges. The south pole of the moon, at the tops of some of the craters, there's perpetual sunlight. That's good because you can be gathering energy from solar panels. But when you're in the sunlight on the moon, the temperature is hundreds of degrees. As soon as you go into shadow, the temperature is hundreds of degrees below zero. You're talking about major challenges when it comes to temperature control. The dust on the moon is sticky and it gets into everything. And it was one thing when you were going to go outside of your tent once and that was it. It's another thing completely if you're talking about coming and going and trying to make sure that you can screw your helmet back on and it doesn't get stuck from the dust. There's challenges when it comes to communication because if you are at the south pole of the moon, making sure that you have continual communication with the Earth, that you're not constantly disappearing from that, is a challenge. And have I misstated anything? Because it's entirely possible.
Well, I think you were talking in Fahrenheit, so it's about 100 Celsius. So, but yes, no, everything else you said was right.
Thank you for translating for a European audience. And you mentioned the South Pole, and this is the first time that we'll be sending humans there as well. Why have we chosen this location?
There's a couple of reasons, but the main reason is the volatile deposits, the water deposits that are at the South Pole. Now, they're in these giant, deep, dark holes, and they're 50 degrees Kelvin inside of them, and that is really hard to get into. And so, but we need to build the infrastructure, the village, if you will, around it so that you can eventually develop the technology to get down in there and get at the water. And so going to the South Pole gives you access to that. There's deposits at the North Pole, but the ones at the South Pole are just a little easier to get to. There's better ridges that have the permanently, almost permanent sunlight there, so you don't have to survive 14 days of minus 100 degrees Celsius or minus 170 degrees Celsius. I mean, a 14-day night on the moon is no joke to get through. That's why every time somebody sends a new spacecraft to the moon and they make it through a night, and there's like, we did it, it's great. And so, I lost my train of thought. There are other good science reasons to go there. It's on the edge of the biggest impact crater on the moon, and the oldest impact crater on the moon, the South Pole Aitken Basin. So if you land near the edge of that, you'll probably be able to get an age date for that, which will be really important for the science of understanding how the moon formed. So there are other. It's also really far from everywhere else we landed, which is really nice because the whole backside of the moon, the whole far side of the moon, is similarly put together as the South Pole. And so we don't have any data points for the whole far side. And so this will be our first one for this massive area on the moon. So there's the practical reason to go there because that's where the water is, but there's a lot of good science reasons to go there as well.
And Ryan, you said that there will be a space rocks curator who's involved in this mission. What are we expecting to find? How is this going to change the work that you're doing?
So once the Artemis samples come back, they'll get folded in with the Apollo samples and be sort of treated as one big collection because the Artemis samples aren't going to be that, at least for the first few missions, aren't going to be that much different than the Apollo missions were from each other. But what we have a very specific view of how the moon formed, and all of the landing sites on the near side were relatively close together, and there was this invisible component to the moon that you and I can't see when we look up at it night. When we look up at the moon at night, you see bright parts and dark parts. And so when they were deciding where to land, that was the only two components they were considering. But there's this third invisible sort of geochemical component that they didn't know about, and all the samples we got back are contaminated by that or strongly influenced by that. And it's not a contaminant, but we thought that was a global process, and it's not. And so getting samples there where we know where they come from, that is far away from that, is going to let us understand what the interior of the moon is, how it's put together much better than we currently do. Because right now, we have a really good model for the near side where we got the samples from. But whether that is, you can extend that to the far side, it's not clear. It'd be like if all you had were samples from France and trying to reconstruct the geology for all of Europe, you'd be missing some important data set points. And so we need those extra data points at this point.
And over the course of the Apollo missions, were there any surprises that were uncovered? Did findings contradict ongoing hypotheses about the moon? You're laughing, I assume.
Yeah, Apollo 16 was not what they were expecting. Apollo 16 astronauts were trained on they were excellent volcanologists. They were trained for what they thought was a volcanic landing site, and it turned out to be the least volcanic landing site on the moon. It was the highlands. They were made out of a rock called anorthosite, and it was impact generated, nothing to do with volcanoes at all. And so, yeah, they picked it based on photogeology, based on morphology of where they were going to land and what they looked like. And then when they got there, and the astronauts had been trained well enough as just sort of general geologists to be like, there's no volcanic rocks here, guys. This is all impact stuff. And so that was a huge surprise. Like, you know, and a super important one, because that's the only true landing site in the highlands. And so 83% of the moon is made up of that type of material, and we only have really good samples from one spot in it. And so that was great. I'm sure there are others.
But, even before the Apollo astronauts landed, when astronomers were looking at the moon and seeing these holes in the moon, they really couldn't tell if those were volcanoes or craters. And there was a lot of supposition that those must be volcanoes. They couldn't possibly be craters. Otherwise, we would have craters all over that doesn't make any sense. And so it really wasn't until we started getting rock samples back from the moon that we could prove that no, the moon is completely covered with craters. And oh, well, yeah, there's a good reason we don't have them all over the Earth. We happen to have a lot of erosion and plate tectonics and things that have gotten rid of them over the years. But yeah, there've been our understanding, like this, we said, of the dates of ages. Some of that has come from meteorites, but a lot has come from the moon.
I'm enjoying talking about the moon, but I want to think bigger slightly. We keep talking about Mars as well, and so the moon is sort of a stopping point on the way to Mars, it seems. Why is Mars next?
Life.
Water.
I mean,
that's exactly what I wanted you to say.
No, I mean, that is. I mean, Mars is so fascinating and has been for, I don't know, when did War of the Worlds get published? I mean, you know, people have been worrying about little green men from Mars for 150 years. We're not worried about little green men so much as we're worried about bacteria, or we want to go and find out if there's life outside of Earth. And the closest, easiest place to get to, most likely place, is Mars. There was liquid water there. The temperature is colder than I'm sure most life would like, but it was within the range that we find life on Earth. And so there's a decent chance, and we have to treat the samples that we collect there like they have life, and we don't know what our reaction will be to that life. And so bringing samples back from Mars is non-trivial. You have to have basically the equivalent of a laboratory where you would study an infectious disease like Ebola, a biosafe BSL-4 lab, to contain that until you're sure it doesn't have life. And so anyway, life is the driving force there.
And to clarify, so none of our scientists expect that there was ever life on the moon. The moon has no atmosphere, has no liquid water. We have frozen water, no liquid water, none of the ingredients that from what we can tell, life requires. What life requires, all life requires water or a liquid. Fundamentally, that is one of the most predominant requirements. And so, yeah, we have this evidence that Mars used to have oceans. Some scientists think there might still be some form of microbial life underground on Mars. Others are like, no, 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 but there might have been in the past. Either way, we're looking for was there life on Mars at one point? Is there life beyond Earth? That is one of the penultimate questions we have. And Mars is one place where we might start to find answers. It is certainly the easiest place for us to get to start looking for those answers.
And now when? What is the timeline for Mars? Do you think it's feasible? What is standing in the way?
I mean, it's feasible, but it's hard. I mean, you know, it's 20 months. It's 20 months of sending someone's outside of our atmosphere in a environment that if they spring a leak, that's it. And so, you know, I think it's a few decades away still. I think even robotically, I think NASA just announced the delay in bringing the robotic samples back from Mars to, I think it was 2035 now, because even getting just small vials of rock back is challenging. And so I think it'll depend on how Artemis goes. I think, you know, how these missions go, how the base that they build at the moon goes, how we, you know, what kind of commitment that we, and I don't just mean NASA, I mean we, all the spacefaring nations want to put to putting people in space. And so might happen in our lifetime, might happen in your lifetime. But I mean, it's, you know, it's always easy when you read the science fiction books. And they just hop in the thing and then they're there, and that's just not how it works. And so it takes a long time. And so, but, you know, a lot of smart people are thinking about how to do it. So I think they're on the right track.
Bad news for those who have been rummaging around in our own science fiction section here at the library. I do want to talk about the human side to this as well, and perhaps the psychological side to this. It's also been announced that with this new mission to the moon, this will be the first time that a woman and then a person of color have walked on the moon's surface. I want to know more about A, how science has diversified since the previous moon missions, and B, the process through which these astronauts are selected, if there's psychological training that they undergo as well, how we're going to keep these people sane when they're stuck in a tiny little craft together for 20 months in search of Martians.
I'll start with what I know, and I'll qualify this, which is not a lot. I know that that the astronauts do undergo rigorous training and a selection process. There are so many people who are eager to go to these places and be astronauts, and so and they're selected not just for their physical, mental, psychological capabilities and abilities to work well with others, but also for specific skills depending on what the mission is. So, so they need a little bit of everything. And I believe, I might be speaking out of turn, I believe that some of the psychological studies have indicated that including women, for instance, on a team helps with the psychology of the group, that can be beneficial. That's about the limit of what I know.
I'll agree with that. I mean, every time NASA tries to get a new class of astronauts, and I think it's the same when ESA does, you get 8,000 applicants or 12,000 applicants for 8 people. And, you know, there's some crazy people in there, but there's also 1,000 highly qualified people. And by the time I've heard, it's very much a black box of how they select the astronauts. It's a mystery a little bit, and I think that's on purpose, because once you get down to the last few hundred people, everyone's highly qualified, and so then it's about finding the right fit from you know, a teammate standpoint, and so and they get a lot of training and very specific training. They like to send them to Antarctica to when they go down to collect the meteorites. It's 8 people in tents in the middle of nowhere for 6 or 8 weeks at a time, and that's about the closest thing you can get to what it's like on space station without actually going on space station. They had underwater, similar type of environment where they put them underwater and they do that. So they specifically train them for that type of long duration, or at least semi-long duration, you know, environment. And so, yeah.
I also want to talk about, on the subject of the sort of human side to the science, to the space travel. We talked about how with the Apollo missions, those were incredibly geopolitically informed. Geopolitics has not gone away. Are there sort of, as we consider travel beyond planet Earth, are there situations on this Earth that could stand in as obstacles to the success of this mission, current space missions? And conversely, is there a sense in which international cooperation has led to exciting developments in space travel and space research?
I would say that international cooperation has definitely been of benefit. Even when there have been geopolitical discomfort, there has continued to be international cooperation. For instance, on the International Space Station, in spite of tensions between the United States and Russia, they continue to work well together in terms of getting astronauts up and back safely and working together there. And we have people from all over the world participating on the International Space Station, and that can't be a bad thing. That's got to be a good thing. So.
Yeah, I mean, even back in the 1970s, when, at the height of the Cold War, the U.S. and the Soviet Union at the time managed to trade the moon rocks they brought back. So the U.S. had brought back the Apollo samples, but the Soviet Union had robotically brought back samples. And so there were a series of exchanges. And so it was finding a way to sort of use the samples as a way to bridge that, that tension that's otherwise there. And so everyone I know involved with the space program tries to keep it as much as apolitical as possible, because that's not the goal. The goal is science and learning in space. And when we start to do some of these other things, this is Ryan's answer, not NASA's answer, just to be super clear for those watching at home, my bosses. It's going to be really expensive to go to Mars. It's going to be really challenging, and I don't think any one country is going to be able to do that on their own. So what that partnership ends up being is not 100% worked out, but I know that NASA and ESA and other space agencies have been talking and figuring out how they're going to do it together, because I don't think no one will be able to do it alone.
And for international or national space flight, and you get out of it what you put into it. So huge benefits are working on it. It's not we're all racing to see who gets the pot of gold at the end. You're creating the pot of gold as you're going. So the process of building the technology and planning and learning from each other and from ourselves and from what we find, that journey is really the greatest riches that you're getting, as opposed to being on Mars and picking up rocks, which we'll learn so much from, and they're really, really critical. But the process of getting there and being there is teaching us so much as well.
So I want to talk more about how we share this process with the wider public, with the less scientifically literate, such as myself. You're an expert in science education. What strategies have you discovered that make it possible to disseminate all this quite dense technical knowledge to the wider public? And why does it matter so much that we know about these moon missions, the Mars on the horizon?
I'm going to start with the first part. Remind me if I don't get around to the second part. I find that we learn, first of all, by finding out what the people that we talk to are interested in, what they want, what they're interested in, what they want to know, and starting from there. And that may be different things for each group of people that you speak with. So starting to find out what you want to know is a good starting point. And then as you talk to more and more people, you get a feeling for where people have been confused by something that someone has said, and ways to correct that, to try to make it a little bit more understandable. I personally love analogies. I love analogies, and I use them frequently, but I have to be careful that I'm not creating a complete misunderstanding in the process. So, for instance, we're in a library. Many very intelligent people do not know the difference between the solar system the galaxy, and the universe. And I discovered this back when I was in college, and my roommate was confused. And I've seen this over and over again. And so when we talk about how we're going to the planets, that gets confused with the universe, and where are we going, and how far is that, and what that is, and what that entails. So I like to use an analogy of, in the library, we're going to pretend our whole solar system, the planets and their moons and the comets and the asteroids, they are one book. This book right here, that's the whole solar system, everything. All the comets, all
Hope
the particles.
and blues. Excellent.
All of these things are in here. Our whole solar system. On the other hand, our galaxy is a room full of books. Every book here has its own star and planets. That's our galaxy. And the universe is the entirety of the library. Everything that we could know, see, or learn about. Analogies is helpful. Listening to your audience and respecting them and respecting what they're interested in. And really digging down there. So that was my answer to the first part of your question, and I don't remember the second part.
Why does it matter that we know these things? Why must we know that we are going to the moon?
Because it's important that NASA does things at the will of the people. NASA is funded by the United States government. It is responsible to the taxpayers, and we do things on behalf of the people. The same thing is true of other space agencies. We have to do things because people want to support that. And if nobody knows about it, nobody's going to want to support it. And if you don't do a good job of sharing what it is, what your goals are, and why they're important, if you can't qualify what I do is important, if you can't say that, then why should anybody fund you to do anything? So it's important, and having a scientifically literate populace is really important to help any organization, any group, any country, or the world move forward and advance to solve our problems. And we'll come up with better solutions if we understand the problems better, and sometimes exploration helps us do that.
And this is why I'm so struck by the work that you do, because it's also critical for a healthy democracy. And in a lot of ways right now, and you stressed that your position was yours and not NASA's. This is Emily's position, not the library's, but our democracy seems a bit sick. It seems a bit unwell. And so is there a link between the sort of suspicion of truth, of facts that we're seeing, and then the urgency to encourage scientific literacy that you are experiencing as well?
I'm going to let you start on that one.
I don't know when being smart or being informed became a bad thing, but it seems like it is. And so, I mean, be it science or something else, it's just important to know how things work and why, and understand the facts behind them. And so, we're excited about what we do because we're scientists, and that's what we like that. That's why we chose that field, and we want everyone else to know. But I want to know what other people do too. I want to understand, what they're learning in their field. And I think, I kind of lost my way through here. But I mean, I think everyone being smarter about what's going on in the world around them can only help. It's just a matter of getting people to listen.
I think that it is critical that we are prepared to learn, that we approach some things with enough of an open mind to listen. There are a group of people out there who believe that we've never left the Earth, and some of them, if you show them some information, show them some data, give them some information, it might open their eyes, but it has to start off with that conversation, with them being willing to have that conversation and to think. And there are others who just refuse to even consider it because one person that they trust told them that we never left the Earth, or that the moon is hollow and filled with aliens, or and these are serious beliefs that people have. And
people also believe that the COVID vaccine will have a microchip inside of you. This disbelief in science spreads, it grows, it leads to disbelief in other areas of knowledge as well.
It is like a poison. As soon as you refuse to accept possibilities and consider possibilities and refuse to listen. Now, scientists themselves have to also recognize that science holds the answers to questions relevant to the nature of the universe, that we cannot answer questions of philosophy. We cannot answer questions of religion. That is not what science is created to do. Science is created to help us resolve questions about our universe. So anyone who comes forward and says, I have the answers to absolutely everything, I might be closed-minded and refuse to listen to that person.
They probably work at Caltech.
I'm rapidly running out of I'm rapidly running out of time, and I have to give this up to the audience soon. But I just want to talk a bit, as we're talking about the sort of age of disinformation, people refusing to believe things that are quite seriously backed up by science. I want to talk about climate as well. Have you seen interest in engagement with space travel, space research change as climate change has become a more urgent issue in our present day?
I don't know that the two are tied, but they're both increasing at the same time, I think.
I mean, understanding climate change is tied to space in that NASA doesn't just study other planets, they study the Earth as well. And, you know, it's satellites that are allowing them to track and understand sort of the global it's one of the many tools that are being used to study the global implications of as our world is changing. So it still has a role. It's not what we do on the moon or Mars may not be directly relevant to climate change on Earth, but that same technology will feed forward into better satellites for Earth and a better way to study and understand and hopefully reverse the climate change that's clearly happening here on Earth. And so I think that's the best tie point I can find for that.
Our first understanding of the greenhouse effect was on Venus. And there are scientists, NASA-funded scientists right now, looking at satellite data from satellites orbiting the Earth, NASA satellites, trying to study things like, well, as the climate changes, will that produce more high clouds, cirrus clouds, or low clouds? And the difference could tell us whether it will reflect more sunlight into space or instead prevent the heat from escaping. Is it going to create a blanket that's going to bounce things back more or hold in the heat more? And
another excellent analogy.
and so we're NASA. That's a really critical part of NASA, that the Earth Science Division that is right next door to the Planetary Division. We work together frequently on things.
Yeah, it's one of the 4 major science divisions at NASA is the Earth Science Division. So it is a quarter of what NASA does. I don't know if the budget works out that way, but it's certainly 25% of our divisions.
Can we have a final round of applause for our extraterrestrial, extraordinary speakers tonight? We've got time for questions, so we'll start with our in-person audience. Raise your hand very high, and Alfonso will bring you a microphone, and then we'll switch to Zoom if we have time.
Hey, good evening. My name is Joseph. I'm a postgraduate student at Georgetown University in security studies. And so while I'm back in Paris, I had to take advantage of my mom's, Apple TV subscription. And I stumbled upon a show called All of Mankind, For All of Mankind. And it talks about the space race. And it talks about, what if the Soviets kept going in this monumental adventure that is spatial conquest. And one of the premises of the show is the increased militarization of space and the increased militarization of the moon, and to the point that I don't want to spoil the show for anyone, but they basically put they put military bases on the moon. And I was wondering if I heard hints of optimism from you, ma'am, and I was wondering if nevertheless that was still a potential form of escalation, form of militarization that could happen in our era. Thank you.
I think we are capable of escalating anything anywhere. Antarctica has been a place where countries around the world have shared space and been working together for quite some time now. There are efforts to create a treaty for the moon to do something similar with it. I don't think they've gotten as far as we would like. And, you know, everybody wants to be the one to say, yeah, this is my space, I'm going to mark it. But I don't know how valuable, what the point of that is.
I mean, most of Antarctica is claimed by 1, 2, or more countries, but yet everyone seems to still work pretty peacefully down there. Antarctica is actually a place that might have resources that are valuable and, you know, viable on Earth. And so, but yet people are still able to do it peacefully down there. And while that's a difficult environment to work in, it's a lot easier to work there than it is to work in space. So what the future holds, no one knows for sure, of course, but there is a huge effort to keep militarization of space from happening. There's a special UN committee on the Peaceful Use of Space, UNCAPUS, or I don't know. I'm sure that's not how they'd like their acronym to be pronounced, but that's how I like to pronounce it. But I mean, there's a standing committee and regular meetings to address this, and so I know there was a UN vote yesterday that didn't go through about not a nuclear weapons ban in space, so it got vetoed. But you know, but there's you guess. Okay. So anyway, we'll see. But so far, so good.
I have a question. I know that you mentioned about the cooperation that there is with the ESA, so the European Space Agency, and since we're here in Europe and France, what can you give us a little bit more information as to how the United States, NASA, works with the ESA?
I mean, I only know my little part of the my little part of the elephant, but on the planetary missions, ESA has their own missions, NASA has their own missions, but they often build instruments that they would include on the other organizations' spacecraft. NASA has a lot of deep space communications assets, giant dishes, and so we help with communications, that kind of thing.
So yeah, they partner. There are scientists funded through ESA who are participating on NASA missions and doing research. For one of the rovers on Mars, the Curiosity rover, has an instrument that I'm aware of because we've helped with some of the education and public engagement for that instrument, and some of the scientists on it are French, here in France, working on it. Conversely, some of the scientists that I work with at the Lunar Planetary Institute are scientists working with one of the ESA missions that's going to be going to Venus. So, to be clear, they're not flying people to Venus. Yeah.
No, we can start that rumor. Let's start that rumor.
But these are all robotic missions.
Hello. Can you please talk about some fascinating innovation which is happening in space exploration? As an example, a couple of weeks back, or a couple of days back, I read a news article which talks about that the Chinese, they have developed a kind of rocket which has nuclear reactor which opens up in the space. And I also saw the news which talks about that DARPA has given a company, Grumman Northrop, a contractable lunar railway, which for me is extremely fascinating. And then a few years back, I went to a startup exhibition in Paris, and over there I saw a fascinating pod which is being developed, or which is already developed by a space startup which is called Interstellar Lab. And this pod actually has plants. It's a standalone ecosystem which can grow plants, etc. For me, it is extremely fascinating. So I'm sure you know much more than what I read in the news. Can you please talk about some fascinating stuff? Thank you.
Actually, I think we both just learned some stuff. So I don't know anything about those specifically, actually, but I will say that there are future missions that are planned to Europa and all the way out to Titan, and and so they're going to melt their way into they're going to try to get down to the ocean on Europa.
The Europa Clipper is going to orbit it first and study it from,
it's not
it's not planning on going into it yet. But
Okay. And but to the Titan, I'm confusing it with the Titan, and
Dragonfly is flying through the atmosphere.
Dragonfly
You are
is
right.
going to land on the surface of Titan, and then hop around like a dragonfly and study different points on the surface and understand the liquid methane lakes or ethane lakes that are there. And so we're going to learn about entirely new environments. And so those are both coming in the next 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, the Europa Clipper is launching this year. Europa is a moon around Jupiter. Now, the outside of this moon is completely irradiated by Jupiter's intense radiation bands, so very hostile to life. The radiation would be ripping life apart. But underneath a thick crust of frozen water, there are salty seas. We have evidence of this. We already told you, water, life. There may be giant alien octopuses down there or something. We don't know. So we want to learn more about it from the outside first.
That's a dangerous image to plant in our minds.
And then eventually the inside. But right now we don't even know which spots are the thinnest spots. And we're not prepared yet to go. The last thing we want to do is go to Mars or Europa or one of these other places that might have alien life and discover that our bacteria killed that alien life and it's not there anymore. Or we bring our bacteria there and we discover life and it's us. It's ours. So there's a lot of steps that need to happen before we get there. But yeah, some of these technologies are really amazing, what we're planning. And these are missions that are funded, that are moving forward now. But lots and lots of ideas are out there in terms of what could be done on the moon, what could be done to get into space, what could be done in orbit around the Earth. Some of the ideas are brilliant, and yet, there's ideas about giant billboards in space. And I thought, I'm not really sure how many of us really are fond of that. But anyway.
Thank you. Hi. Well, actually, I had a question on were there any concerns of bringing on our own bacteria on Mars, but I guess you kind of answered that right now. So another question would be, is there any ambition or could it be a goal to bring life on Mars and see if it would survive?
No, probably not. I mean, it's hard to say that definitively, but there's a huge portion of the effort that goes into sending any spacecraft to Mars is to make sure it is devoid of life, that we don't accidentally forward contaminate Mars with life. And so bringing something there just to see how it would react in the environment, well, it'd be great as long as it died. But if it didn't die, we had, now put tardigrades or something else that's hardy. And so I can't imagine a U.S.-based or European-based mission getting approved to bring that kind of experiment. They do have experiments to see how life would survive. They have radiation exposure experiments and stuff like that, but they don't involve because planetary protection is it's an international. It's like a UN level thing where you have to be careful both directions.
That being said, if in 100 years we discover that there isn't and has never ever been life on Mars, then sure. As long as we're not like introducing rabbits to Australia or something where we bring something that takes over the planet. We are taking people. It might be a little difficult for those first people are going to find it a little bit difficult. It's not like you can deliver pizza to Mars, right? Uber's not going to be present. There's going to be so many limitations in terms of what we can do. It's going to be very hard at first. And I don't know how many people will be staying and how many people will be going for a quick visit to learn a bit and come right back.
The book, since we're in a library, the book The Martian by Andy Weir is a really good understanding of how hard it is to do things in space because he doesn't fudge the time. It's like, we're going to go save him. Okay, that's going to take 8 months. To get there. Or he's got to survive. He's got to eat potatoes for 237 days in a row. And so it really gives you, not everything in that book is perfectly right, but most of it is. And a lot of the physics and the time scales involved are. So that is a really good example of what it takes to work in space.
and is in our collection, I believe. I'm getting the thumbs up. It's in our collection. It's good news. We have time for one more question. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I just wanted to ask about something you mentioned at the beginning about a desire to have a rock from early Earth. And it made me think, how would you know it was from early Earth? And then I remembered that from early, it's like a 7th grade science class, that the moon was created by an asteroid that dislodged a large chunk of Earth. So is it all early Earth, or how does that work?
I'm going to handle one aspect of your question, and I'm going to let Ryan handle the more important, bigger part. A lot of people, when they hear about how the moon formed, have a picture in their heads from the words that were used that sometimes is misleading. So picture something about half as wide as the Earth. Picture the early solar system, lots of stuff, lots of debris, giant chunks of stuff floating around the sun, and one that's half the width of our Earth running into the Earth. That collision creates enough energy that everything kind of melts and splatters. So imagine a giant pond of lava, and you throw a rock into it that's half lava already, you're going to melt everything and you're going to splatter stuff. The splatter is what winds up accreting around the Earth and slowly coming together to form the moon. So rather than a single chunk of the Earth, which is what most people have in their heads, it wasn't a chunk of the Earth, it was a splatter that included pieces of that first rock and the Earth, mostly the outside, mostly not the core, splattered and slowly came together to be the moon. I wanted to add that and then let Ryan answer the full answer here.
So yeah, imagine after the impact, that Earth had a ring like Saturn does now, and that ring collects into that would be what became our moon. And so, but you're right. So most of that material came from Earth. But that's when the clock starts at 4.5 billion years. And then the moon evolved one way, and the Earth evolved a different way. And the Earth had a fair amount of water. The moon was largely devoid of water. And so the rocks on Earth and the rocks on the moon are chemically different enough that there are a few ways to tell them apart. And so the ratio of the element iron to manganese in it, or there's a few others as well. And so people have proposed to have found terrestrial meteorites on the moon. I think few other scientists have shown that they were probably not correct, or certainly there's not consensus within the scientific community. But the moon is a relatively simple geologic place in that there's only 4 or 5 minerals make up 99.1% of the surface. And so if we start finding exotic minerals in a rock, that would be a really good way to be like, oh, wait, that probably didn't form on the moon, because you can tell from the nature of the minerals or the rock itself whether it formed in a wet environment or with interacting with an atmosphere, or there'd be a bunch of different tells that you would allow you to figure out, oh no, that didn't form on the moon itself. It didn't have to come from Earth. It could come from Mars. We find pieces of the moon and pieces of Mars on Earth, meteorites that have been blasted off the surface and fall to Earth. And so that same process could happen in reverse, and so there'd be a lot of work to do it, and it will be a big deal when it finally happens. So,
can we have a final round of applause for our speakers tonight?